I want to take up this issue of de-radicalisation and the Islamist terrorist threat, especially after what unfolded in London earlier this week. I'm joined by Daniel Lewkovitz, who's a security expert. Thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks, Chris.
There's been a lot of focus on the de-radicalisation programs and people saying that they don't work. They've always been a challenge. Even people who support de-radicalisation programs admit that they're very, very difficult. This terrorist in London was actually attending a seminar. He'd been released from jail and was obviously at least fooling people that he was happy to go along with rehabilitation and de-radicalisation programs, yet obviously still harboured terrorist intent.
Well, that's exactly right. And people in London are not that easily fooled. And the fact that this terrorist and this scumbag was wearing an ankle tracking bracelet at the time he was actually out murdering people, I think did not go unnoticed by a whole lot of people. And I think one of the problems that we have in the whole narrative is that government throws lots and lots of money at problems, and this is by no means unique to terrorism. They throw lots of money at all sorts of problems, but in looking at a return on investment and thinking, does that work, it's very important. If you look at the UK example, they had a Home Office report that said there were 33 programs funded by government, of which only 2 were found to be effective. And from the result of what we saw the other week, you'd also be questioning the effectivity of that. And one of the things that came out in that report was that they said that teachers in schools who were considered a part of this, and particularly in sort of high-risk areas, were afraid to bring up matters of race and religion with their students without appearing discriminatory.
Yeah, well, this is a huge problem in the debate. I often talk about the jihad denialism in our public debate and in our political debate, but you've got to confront the menace here, and for instance, the London attack just shows how extreme that is, because the victims that this bloke killed were the very people who were looking to accommodate him, to help him, to support prisoners in their rehabilitation. Now, governments like ours need to deal with this. We've got a lot of people in jail now on terrorist-related offences. We've had people released from jail in terrorist-related offences and then go and join ISIS in Syria. Now, some of these people are actually convicted of terrorist offences when they're quite young. The prospect that they may never be rehabilitated is a really challenging one for us, because they will be released from jail at some stage.
And if we look at some of the people who've been convicted of terrorism in Australia, for example, those convicted of the Penn Dennis plot, and that would have been a horrific attack on Sydney, they were jailed for up to 28 years in about 2005, which means that they're going to be out in perhaps 2030, but with a bit of good behaviour, perhaps in less than a decade. And these are not going to be old men in wheelchairs by that stage. And so part of the problem is we can look at people who've already been convicted and then they may come out of the prison system with a chip on their shoulder. But looking at all of this de-radicalisation, it's not just trying to sort of de-radicalise people who've already been radicalised, it's also a preventative program. And one of the problems that we have is because we're not talking about the elephant in the room, as you said. I mean,
that's a good point. You've got to have that de-radicalisation in place in communities before you get to any sort of legal problem or criminal problem, correct, terrorist problem. But the point here too is that I think Australian laws have changed so that if there are threats about a prisoner, realistic threats about terrorist intent, they can keep them in jail indefinitely. But I wouldn't expect they're going to be using those laws. They'll be tested in the courts. It won't be easy. But this is the threshold question, is whether a country like Australia is prepared then to keep someone in jail forever because we believe that they haven't been rehabilitated from an Islamist terrorist point of view, or whether we should be keeping on with these de-radicalisation programs and hoping that you can turn people around.
Well, I think with all of these things, you have to actually look at return on investment and see where the results actually work. If we look at, say, the UK example, where even they conceded that these programs don't work, and there's not a lot of evidence of de-radicalisation programs having worked anywhere on earth, but when we look at the Australian example, our government has spent something like $47 million to date on these programs, and that builds a lot of community halls, it creates a whole lot of community projects, and a cynic would argue that there's a big industry that's sort of taking all of these funds and saying they're being put to good use, but not necessarily preventing the problem. One of the products that came out of this was something called the Step Together helpline, and this was a phone line that was developed at a cost of several $1 million, to which people in communities who were worried about violent extremism could report and say that someone had been radicalised. And what they found is very shortly afterwards, some of the criticism came in that having spent millions, they'd received maybe 5 calls, one of which was some bloke ringing up concerned that his daughter had started dating a Muslim. It was not showing a result. And one of the things that they didn't realise is that the signs and the symptoms of radicalisation can mean different things to different people. For example, if you had, say, a third-generation Australian-born, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid from Maroubra who suddenly grew a beard and started attending the mosque, that might set a few people's radar off and they might think something's changed. Whereas if you take the same child from a Muslim-born family in southwestern Sydney and he grows a beard and starts going to mosque, not only would that not raise any alarm, his parents might actually be delighted about it. Now, they could both end up in the same situation, but only one of those is going to sound alarm bells. So I think there are communities that could do a lot.
Well, the communities know. The communities, people know what's happening with people around them, and you've got to rely on them speaking up if possible. We do have hotlines akin to that in Australia. Thanks so much for joining us, Daniel. I appreciate it. Daniel Lewkovitz there.